Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Sayanagori back here with Femhealth. Today, I am talking to Dr. Kimberly Thornton. You have seen her on our channel before. She is an REI specialist with RMA of New York. Today, we are going to be talking about what is a blastocyst in the context of IVF. So many women that we know are going through IVF, and it is a very confusing procedure, and blastocyst is a term that we do hear very often. So we want to ask the expert today, what does it mean and what's the significance? Welcome, Dr. Thornton. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. So a blastocyst is an embryo, and it's a stage of an embryo. So when somebody goes through IVF, they have their egg retrieval. So the first day we're extracting eggs. 24 hours later, we can see how many fertilized normally. And then we usually watch those embryos that fertilize normally to what's called a blastocyst stage, which typically happens 5 to 7 days later after fertilization. That is usually, I would say, the stage at typically what most IVF centers these days will use to transfer an embryo back. Blastocyst embryos are also the stage where we can test them to see if they're genetically and chromosomally normal. Our embryologists usually will grade the blastocyst at that stage. So they usually have like a number grading in front of them, and the number, it describes how expanded the blastocyst is. And so typically, it's most ideal if they're 4, 5, 6s. 4s means they're fully expanded. 5 means they've started to hatch. 6 means they're fully hatched. But sometimes we'll consider, transferring at certain centers 3 embryos, especially if they haven't had PGT testing. They usually have to be a little bit more expanded for that testing, but sometimes good quality can be not as expanded. And then they have letter grades. So the first letter describes the cells that will essentially become the baby, or what we call the inner cell mass. And they give them letter grades like A, B, C, D, A being the best, D being the worst. And the second letter describes the cells that are going to become essentially the placenta or the trifectoderm, and they also have letter grades. And we look at how fast they make it to the blastocyst stage. So most embryologists will select the faster embryos, like the day 5s. They'll usually selectively transfer over, maybe day 6 or day 7 if that one has like an equal or strong grading.
You mentioned hatched versus unhatched. Which is better? Or just a process?
It's just a process. So a lot of times, I have patients that are concerned, oh, mine's not hatching. Well, a lot of times that's going to happen after, especially if we froze an embryo or we put it back after we thawed the embryo or after we transfer it back. We do know if they're fully hatched, they are a little bit more fragile. So they a lot of extra care has to be happening with them as far as the freezing or unfreezing process. So it's not necessarily better if they're fully hatched versus not at the time of transfer.
Okay, great. So anything else that someone going through IVF should know about blastocysts?
I think one of the things people really get hung up on is the grading of the embryo. And we nowadays can test embryos. We can take some cells from that trifectoderm, we can send it to a genetic lab, they can sequence the DNA of each embryo and see which ones are healthy. While, years in the past, we didn't have that technology. So the grading was really used because we were trying to figure out, well, which one we think is the best, which one is probably healthy. And a lot of times now, maybe the embryo that doesn't look the most beautiful on the outside is actually the one that is the healthiest and the one with the highest potential. That is really, I would say, probably one of the more important things, and not to get too upset. Of course, there can be gradings where we do get concerned and a doctor may say, okay, this one may not have the highest potential, but most even, fair graded embryos that are genetically healthy often have, between a 50 to 70% chance of a live birth. And so I would say that that's probably the most important key factor for embryo health.
Thank you so much. This was really informative. We really appreciate you being here.